Ancient temples held the keys to entire economies. We see them as silent monuments for prayer, but that view is incomplete. Recent discoveries by historians and archaeologists paint a very different picture. These sacred complexes were the beating financial hearts of the world's first cities. This video is an investigation into that hidden reality. By the end, you will understand how the very foundations of banking, administration, and trade were invented not in modern offices, but within temple walls. How did a place of worship also become a warehouse, a bank, and a corporate headquarters? What kind of power did that give the people who ran it? The separation of church and state is a profoundly modern idea. In antiquity, the temple was often the state, and its vaults held the future of civilization itself. What does it truly mean for a place to be considered sacred? The modern mind tends to file temples away under a single category, a quiet place for quiet reflection, but that is a profound misunderstanding of their ancient reality. To walk through the gates of a major temple complex in Sumer or ancient Egypt was not to enter a simple chapel. You were stepping into a walled city within a city, a humming center of industry and administration that governed every aspect of daily life. Picture a sprawling campus, not of quiet prayer halls alone, but of massive mud brick granaries rising several stories high, filled with the collective harvest of the region. Workshops within the walls produced everything from fine linen and pottery to exquisite jewelry and bronze tools. Scribes trained in adjacent schools, learning to keep the meticulous records that made this entire operation possible. A small army of priests, artisans, accountants, guards, and laborers lived and worked on the grounds. This was not a side business for the faithful, it was the core function. The temple was, in essence, the first truly integrated corporation, a powerhouse that combined spiritual authority, economic control, and bureaucratic innovation under one sacred roof. To understand the economy of these early cities, you must first look past the altar and see the warehouse, the ledger, and the seal. This immense power began with a simple, profound fact: the temple owned the land. It was the divine landlord. Across Mesopotamia and Egypt, kings and wealthy elites would grant vast tracts of fertile territory to a temple complex, not as a casual gift, but as a sacred investment. These were not small plots for a garden, they were sprawling agricultural estates, sometimes encompassing entire villages and their populations. The logic was both spiritual and brilliantly practical. By giving land to the gods, you ensured their favor, and you also placed the most critical resource of all, food production, under the most stable, enduring institution in society. Who would work this divine land? A whole class of people existed for this purpose, from tenant farmers who paid a share of their crop, to dependent laborers who received rations directly from the temple stores, to individuals in various forms of service who worked the fields. This system created a predictable, controllable food supply on a massive scale. The true genius, however, was not in the growing but in the gathering. Every harvest season, a river of grain, dates, and other staples flowed into the temple's monumental granaries. These towering mud brick silos were the ancient equivalent of a central bank's gold vault. This stored surplus was not just food, it was the primary capital of the entire civilization. Think of every granary as a battery, storing the energy of the sun and the soil. That stored energy could then be converted into anything. It paid the artisans crafting tools in the temple workshops. It fed the soldiers guarding the city walls. It supported the scribes managing the accounts. Most importantly, this capital could be loaned out or traded. A merchant planning a long-distance expedition could receive a loan of grain from the temple, trade it for copper or timber in another city, and return to repay the loan with interest, all recorded on a clay tablet. So before the first coin was ever minted, before the first ledger was written in ink, the economy ran on sacred grain, measured out by the priests of a god who was, in every practical sense, the wealthiest landowner in the world. This constant flow of goods required a system far more sophisticated than simple storage. Within the temple's secure walls, a new kind of institution was quietly being born, one that would shape economies for millennia to come. The temple became the world's first true bank. In the bustling city-states of ancient Mesopotamia, this role was absolutely central. Think of the temple complex not just as a holy site, but as the most trusted vault in the known world. A wealthy merchant embarking on a risky caravan journey to a distant land could not carry his entire fortune with him. Instead, he would bring his surplus grain, silver, or prized lapis lazuli to the temple. In exchange, the temple scribes would issue him a clay tablet, a receipt detailing exactly what was deposited. This tablet was his security. It was a promise that his wealth was protected by the gods themselves, guarded by divine authority and the temple's own militia. He could travel with confidence and upon his return, present the tablet to reclaim his valuables, minus a small fee for the safeguarding service. This solved a fundamental problem of early commerce. It created a safe, neutral ground for storing capital, separating wealth from the peril of travel or the vulnerability of a private home. But the temple's financial innovation went far beyond mere storage. It began to actively circulate capital through a system of credit and loans. A farmer whose crops had failed could receive a loan of seed grain from the temple stores to plant for the next season. An artisan needing raw materials could get an advance. These loans were not acts of charity. They were financial instruments that came with an expected return. Interest, however, was a concept that had to be handled carefully within a sacred framework. Charging explicit interest could be seen as morally questionable. So a brilliant workaround emerged. A loan might be formally recorded as an offering to the temple god, with the understanding that the repayment would include a generous gift above the principal amount. This extra portion functioned identically to interest, fueling the temple's growing reserves while maintaining the appearance of pious exchange. The temple, therefore, was not a passive vault. It was an active economic engine, pumping stored surplus back into the community as productive capital and growing its own divine portfolio in the process. Crucial to all of this trust was standardization. Before the temple's involvement, a trade could be fraught with conflict. What if my basket of grain was slightly smaller than yours? What if my lump of silver was less pure? The temple priests, as neutral arbiters trusted by all, established and enforced standardized weights and measures. They maintained the official stone weights, the certified volume containers for barley. A transaction recorded at the temple using these standards carried immense authority. It reduced the risk of dispute and fraud, making commerce faster, smoother, and far more trustworthy. This system of reliable measurement was as vital to their economy as a stable currency is to ours. It meant a merchant from one city could do business with a trader from another, both relying on the credibility of the temple's scales. So the next time you deposit a check or take out a loan, remember the echo of an ancient practice. The concept of a secure bank, a line of credit, and a standardized system of value did not begin on Wall Street. It began in the shadow of a ziggurat, where priests doubling as accountants turned faith into the bedrock of finance. But all of this economic activity created a new kind of problem, one of memory and trust. How could the temple possibly keep track of everything? The grain flowing into the granaries, the wool distributed to weavers, the beer rations given to laborers, the loans of silver to merchants. A human mind could not hold it all, and a spoken promise could be forgotten or disputed. The solution to this problem did not emerge from a desire for poetry or history. It was born from pure practical necessity. The world's first system of writing, Cuneiform in ancient Sumer, was invented specifically to serve as the temple's accounting software. Those early marks pressed into damp clay were not philosophical musings. They were receipts, inventories, and payroll records. Picture a temple scribe, his hands coated in fine clay dust, carefully using a reed stylus to make wedge-shaped impressions on a small tablet. He is not writing a prayer, he is creating a permanent, undeniable record. One tablet might list, in precise symbols, that 10 laborers received their daily ration of 1 liter of barley each. Another might document that a merchant named Namu deposited 5 shekels of silver in the temple vault, with a date and a witness seal. A third might be a ledger of all the sheep and goats owned by the temple god, noting which were born, which were sheared, and which were used in ceremonial practices. This was a revolution in accountability. For the first time in human history, an economic transaction could exist independently of the people who made it. The clay tablet did not forget, it did not lie, it sat in the temple archive as a cold, hard fact. This allowed for planning on a scale previously unimaginable. Temple administrators could now look at last year's harvest records, compare them to this year's seed distribution, and forecast how much grain would be available for the coming winter. They could track the productivity of workshops, manage complex labor rotations, and settle disputes by simply retrieving the relevant tablet. Writing transformed the temple from a large household into a true administrative state. It created a system of economic memory, a way to project the past into the future, making the entire civilization more resilient, more predictable, and far more powerful. The very symbols that would later be used to write epic poetry and law codes began as mundane notes about jars of oil and baskets of dates. Our entire tradition of record-keeping, from ledgers to databases, starts right here in the storerooms of a Sumerian temple, where the need to count the wealth of the gods gave humanity the tools to write its own history. The silent clay tablets tell a vivid story of daily life. One common record details the distribution of rations, a list of names followed by precise amounts of barley, beer, oil, and wool. This was not a shopping list, it was a paycheck. The temple's entire workforce, from the high priest to the apprentice potter, was paid in this way, through a system historians call a redistribution economy. It functioned with elegant simplicity. The temple, as the central collector, gathered the immense agricultural surplus from its lands and the offerings of the people. This vast stockpile was then meticulously measured out and redistributed as daily sustenance to everyone who served the institution. A guard received a ration of bread and beer for his vigilance. A weaver received wool to turn into cloth, plus a ration of grain to feed her family. A scribe was compensated with oil for his lamp and barley for his table. This system solved a fundamental challenge of early urban life. It allowed large numbers of people to live and work in a city without farming. For the first time, society could support full-time specialists. A person could spend a lifetime mastering the art of metallurgy, sculpture, or administration, secure in the knowledge that the temple granary would provide their next meal. This was the engine of cultural advancement. The stunning jewelry, the durable pottery, the monumental architecture, all of it was made possible because the artisan did not have to spend their days in the fields. They were free to innovate, to refine their craft, because the temple's economic machine ensured their basic needs were met. This created a powerful social contract. In return for their skill and labor, individuals received not just food but also identity and security. Their place within the temple's hierarchy defined their role in the world. This redistribution system was the glue that held the early city together, transforming a collection of people into a coordinated civilization with distinct roles, fostering stability and enabling the explosion of art, technology, and complex culture that defines these ancient societies to this day. The temple's granaries and ledgers provided the fuel, but its workshops were where that fuel was transformed into power. Beyond the fields and storehouses, the sacred complex buzzed with the sounds of industry, the rhythmic clang of metalworkers, the steady hum of spinning wheels, and the intense heat of kilns. Temples operated as the first major industrial centers, directing specialized craft production on a scale no individual household could ever achieve. Take the example of textiles, one of the most vital commodities in the ancient world. Within temple precincts, large workshops housed teams of weavers, predominantly women, who transformed raw wool from the temple's own flocks into vast quantities of cloth. This was not a casual craft, it was a standardized, high-output operation. The temple provided the materials, the tools like vertical looms and the rations, and in return it owned the entire output. This system produced everything from coarse fabric for worker clothing to incredibly fine linen, and dyed wool for elite garments and religious vestments. The same model applied to metalworking. Temple workshops smelted copper and tin to forge bronze, creating tools, weapons, and ceremonial objects. Potters produced standardized vessels by the thousands, from simple bowls for daily rations to exquisite painted pottery for temple rituals and elite trade. This centralized control offered a tremendous advantage: consistency. A merchant traveling to a distant city could carry a cargo of pottery all stamped with the same temple seal. That seal was not just a mark of ownership, it was a brand, a guarantee of quality and measure. It told the buyer that this jar would hold the exact volume it claimed, that this piece of cloth was woven to a known standard, that this bronze tool was made from properly alloyed metal. In a world without universal regulations, the temple's reputation became the most trusted standard. Goods bearing its seal carried an inherent premium, circulating through regional trade networks with enhanced value and credibility. This transformed the temple's output into a powerful economic tool. The surplus cloth, tools, and luxury goods produced under its roof could be traded for resources the city lacked, like timber, precious stones, or exotic metals. The temple was not merely storing wealth, it was actively manufacturing it, turning raw materials from its lands and trade networks into finished products that reinforced its economic influence and spiritual prestige across the entire region. This vast production of goods demanded a secure and orderly way to exchange them. The temple's authority did not stop at its workshop doors. It extended into the very heart of public commerce, transforming chaotic barter into regulated trade. Within the protective shadow of the temple walls or in adjacent plazas sanctified by its presence, you would find the bustling ancient marketplace. This was no informal gathering. It was a supervised economic zone. Temple officials acted as the world's first market regulators and notaries. Their primary tool was the enforcement of those standardized weights and measures we discussed earlier. A merchant selling grain would use a volume container certified by the temple. A trader offering silver would weigh it on scales balanced against the temple's official stone weights. This eliminated a major source of conflict and fraud, building a foundation of trust that allowed strangers to do business. Beyond measurement, temple authorities in some cultures could even influence or set price equivalencies. While not a modern command economy, the temple's immense purchasing power and its role as the largest producer of staples like grain and cloth created a de facto benchmark. If the temple was paying a certain amount of silver for a day's labor or selling a standard jar of oil for a set price, that rate echoed throughout the marketplace, bringing a semblance of stability to the value of goods. The need for a more fluid medium of exchange than bulky grain or livestock led to another monumental innovation: the emergence of proto-money, often under temple supervision. In Mesopotamia, alongside silver by weight, we find evidence of silver rings and coils of a consistent size and purity. These were not just jewelry, they were a form of pre-coinage currency, easy to transport and count. Where were these stored and likely certified? In the temple treasury. Similarly, in Mesoamerica, the cacao bean became a widely accepted currency for smaller transactions, and vast stores of these beans were kept in temple storerooms. The temple's role here was crucial. It provided a trusted authority that could vouch for the authenticity and value of these early monetary forms. By safeguarding these stores and likely overseeing their circulation, the temple effectively acted as a central bank, managing the money supply long before the concept had a name. This regulation of trade and issuance of trusted value transformed the temple precinct into the economic nucleus of the city. It was a one-stop hub where you could have your measures certified, your contract witnessed by a scribe, your currency exchanged, and your disputes settled by a priest acting as a judge. This created a safe, predictable environment where commerce could flourish, drawing in merchants from across the region and generating wealth that reinforced the temple's power in a self-perpetuating cycle of sacred and secular authority. This sacred status was not just a spiritual concept, it was a formidable economic asset. In a world where kings could fall, cities could be sacked, and fortunes could be seized overnight, the temple complex stood apart as a uniquely protected space. Its walls were considered inviolable, its storerooms sacrosanct. To violate them was to risk the wrath of the gods themselves, a threat that carried more weight than any royal decree. This perception of divine protection transformed the temple into the ultimate safe deposit box, a sanctuary for wealth in the most literal sense. When conflict loomed or a dynasty crumbled, where would a merchant, a landowner, even a rival noble, choose to secure their most valuable possessions? Not in their own home, but within the hallowed and heavily guarded precincts of the temple. This practice drew deposits from every level of society, from the modest savings of a craftsman to the vast treasures of the elite, all seeking the same guarantee of safety. This massive influx of external wealth, held in trust by the temple, created something far more valuable than gold or grain. It created trust capital. The temple became the most credible institution in the land, its reputation for security and fairness backed by cosmic authority. With this unparalleled reservoir of trust, the temple could undertake ventures of a scale and risk that would paralyze any individual. Think of a long-distance trade expedition to a land beyond the mountains, a journey taking many months, fraught with bandits, uncertain markets, and unpredictable weather. No single merchant, no matter how wealthy, could reasonably finance such a perilous gamble with their entire fortune. But the temple could. It could assemble a consortium, pooling resources from its own vast stores and the deposits entrusted to it, to outfit a caravan of unprecedented size. It could spread the risk across its entire portfolio. If one ship sank or one caravan was lost, the temple's overall wealth remained secure, allowing it to absorb the loss and try again. This ability to underwrite massive, high-risk, high-reward projects was revolutionary. It enabled the import of exotic materials like lapis lazuli from Afghanistan or tin from far beyond the known world, materials essential for the prestige goods and advanced technologies that defined elite culture. The temple's sacred walls, therefore, did more than keep thieves out. They built a fortress of financial confidence, allowing the entire civilization to reach further, build bigger, and dream on a scale that was previously impossible. This immense economic machine had a name in ancient Sumer, the Acute, pronounced simply as house, but this was no ordinary household. It was the house of a god, a divine estate so vast and intricately organized it puts modern corporations to shame. To understand the true scale of this operation, we can look to real examples preserved in the clay. The Acute of the goddess Bao, for instance, in the city of Gersu, managed a staggering portfolio. Its archives record control over thousands of acres of prime agricultural land, orchards of date palms, and herds of livestock numbering in the tens of thousands, from sheep and goats to cattle and donkeys. This was not passive ownership, Every single asset was meticulously tracked. Scribes recorded the yield of each field, the birth of every calf, the shearing of every sheep, and the exact amount of wool assigned to each weaver in the temple's textile workshops. The Eocute functioned as a completely self-contained economic universe. It grew its own food, processed its own materials, manufactured its own goods, and distributed everything to its massive workforce through that precise ration system. A single administrative document from the Eocute of Bao might list the monthly barley rations for over 200 individuals, from high officials down to millers and brewers, each amount carefully calculated by status and role. Another tablet could detail the issue of bronze tools to smiths, or the distribution of wool to weavers, with the expected return of finished cloth recorded months later. This was a closed loop of production and consumption, all revolving around the divine beneficiary, the goddess herself, whose statue was believed to inhabit the temple's inner sanctuary. The entire operation was a continuous act of service, sustaining the god's household so the god, in turn, would sustain the world. The complexity is breathtaking. At the Temple of Enki in the city of Eridu, one of Sumer's oldest and most sacred sites, the economic reach extended beyond mere self-sufficiency. Enki's Eocute engaged in long-distance trade, bringing in exotic woods and precious stones for its artisans, and likely exporting surplus grain and fine textiles. The temple's administrators had to coordinate planting cycles, manage irrigation labor, oversee craft production, and balance ledgers, all without the benefit of computers or even paper. They did it with damp clay and a sharp reed, building an administrative state that predates most modern nations. The Eocute was, in essence, a sovereign entity, a holy corporation that blended spiritual authority, economic might, and bureaucratic precision into a single, enduring power structure. It demonstrates that the concept of a large, managed institution directing every facet of life is not a modern invention, but a very ancient one, born from the need to serve a god, and in doing so, organize humanity itself. While the Sumerian Eocute was a holy corporation, the temples of New Kingdom Egypt operated on a truly imperial scale. The pharaohs, considered gods themselves, engaged in a continuous act of divine generosity, endowing their celestial counterparts with staggering wealth. This was not a one-time gift, it was a permanent, flowing river of resources known as the divine offerings. A pharaoh like Ramesses II would grant a temple complex like Karnak, dedicated to the god Amun-Ra, vast tracts of the most fertile land in the Nile Valley. But it went far beyond acreage. Entire villages, complete with their populations of farmers, artisans, and laborers, were given to the temple estate. The people did not move, their lives simply changed management, now working for the divine household of Amun. Furthermore, a portion of the immense tribute flowing into Egypt from conquered territories in Nubia and the Levant was redirected straight to the temple treasuries. Gold, copper, cedar wood, livestock, and even prisoners of war who would become temple servants, all were formally presented as offerings to the god. This created institutions of almost unimaginable wealth and autonomy. The Temple of Amun at Karnak became a state within a state. It owned fleets of ships that plied the Nile, fields that stretched to the horizon, workshops that produced luxury goods, and granaries that could feed cities. Its high priest was one of the most powerful individuals in Egypt, often a royal relative, commanding an army of administrators, priests, and workers. This economic independence created a fascinating and sometimes tense dynamic with the royal palace. The pharaoh was the theoretical source of all temple wealth, yet the temple's growing, self-sustaining power could rival his own. The god's estate paid no taxes to the crown. It recycled its own surplus into more land, more monuments, and more influence. At times, the balance of power tipped. During the reign of the pharaoh Akhenaten, his radical shift to worship a single sun disk, the Aten, was as much an economic revolution as a religious one. By closing the temples of Ammon and seizing their assets for his new capital, he was attempting to dismantle a rival power structure that had grown too strong. The backlash was immense, and after his passing, the traditional priesthoods reclaimed their wealth and authority with a vengeance. The divine offering system shows us that in Egypt, the economy was a sacred circuit, a continuous flow of wealth from the pharaoh to the god and back to the people, but one that could concentrate so much power in the temple's hands that it occasionally threatened to eclipse the very throne that created it. Across the ocean, a parallel story unfolded in the vibrant, complex civilizations of Mesoamerica. The towering pyramid temples of the Aztec and Maya were not silent tombs, but dynamic economic hubs where sacred power and material wealth fused into a single, awe-inspiring system. At the heart of the Aztec Empire stood the Templo Maya, the great temple of Tenochtitlan. This was far more than a place of ceremony. It was the central processing plant for an entire imperial economy, a colossal storehouse fed by the relentless engine of conquest. From the verdant coasts to the distant highlands, conquered city-states were required to send a continuous stream of tribute to the imperial capital. This was not a casual gift, but a meticulously calculated tax recorded in vivid pictographic books called codices. These documents listed in stunning detail the exact quantities of goods each province owed. The lists are staggering: thousands of sacks of cacao beans, the chocolate currency of the realm, huge bales of cotton cloth in standardized lengths and qualities, countless bins of maize, beans, and amaranth, exotic feathers from Quetzal and macaw birds destined for royal headdresses, jags of jade, blocks of obsidian for razor-sharp blades, and even live animals like eagles and jaguars. All of this wealth flowed directly into the temple precinct. Vast warehouses called Petlacalco surrounded the sacred pyramid. Here, an army of temple stewards and accountants would count, sort, and catalog every single item. The temple plaza itself became a living ledger of imperial power, where the physical proof of the empire's reach was openly displayed and stored. This immense concentration of goods served multiple purposes. It provisioned the massive temple staff, the warriors of the elite military orders housed nearby, and the artisans crafting ritual objects. It funded the state's grand construction projects. But crucially, it also created a reservoir for redistribution. During great festivals or in times of local hardship, the temple could release stores of maize or cloth, reinforcing its role as the benevolent provider and strengthening the social bonds that held the empire together. This cycle of extraction, storage, and strategic release made the temple the undeniable economic nucleus of Tenochtitlan. The sacred plaza before the Templo Maya also pulsed with a more public economic energy. On designated days, this space transformed into one of the largest and most spectacular markets in the world, described with awe by the Spanish chroniclers. What made this market extraordinary was its direct connection to the temple's tribute system. Here, goods from every corner of the empire were available. A merchant from the tropical lowlands could sell rubber balls and parrot feathers, next to a trader from the north offering turquoise and fine obsidian blades. The temple's presence guaranteed order and standardized measures, much like its counterparts in Mesopotamia. The goods exchanged in this ritual marketplace, many originating as tribute, were then transformed through craft or traded further, circulating the empire's wealth and creating a vibrant, interconnected economy centered on the sacred complex. Among the Maya, a similar model existed, though often centered on the royal palace temple complexes of city-states like Tikal or Calakmul. The Maya Kayuhul Ajor, or Holy Lord, was the conduit between the gods and the people, and his palace was the administrative and economic heart of the kingdom. Tribute from subordinate villages flowed here in the form of foodstuffs, salt, honey, cotton, and feathers. Scribes kept accounts on bark paper codices, tracking obligations and stores. The palace workshops then turned these raw materials into prestige goods, fine polychrome pottery, elaborate textiles, and jade ornaments, which were used in ritual, gifted to loyal nobles, or traded with distant partners. The temple's role in this system was inseparable from the king's. Public ceremonies on the temple steps often involved the distribution of wealth, such as cacao or finely woven garments, to the elite and the public, a performative act of redistribution that cemented loyalty and displayed the king's divinely sanctioned generosity. In both the Aztec and Maya worlds, the temple complex was the anchor point of a cosmic economy. It drew in the material bounty of the world through conquest and obligation, sanctified it through ritual, and then strategically released it to fuel society, craft, and loyalty. The pyramid was not just a stairway to the heavens, it was the loading dock for an entire civilization. Who managed this divine fortune? Behind every ledger and granary stood a figure who was neither purely a holy man nor a simple clerk. The priesthood of these early temples formed the world's first professional bureaucracy, a managerial class whose expertise in numbers and words granted them authority rivaling that of kings. These were not just spiritual guides, they were the chief financial officers, the operations managers, and the legal arbiters of their entire society. Their roles were often passed down within families, creating dynasties of administrators who grew up learning the intricate systems of the temple estate. This hereditary knowledge was a source of immense power, but it also came with a rigorous requirement, literacy. To serve the god effectively, one had to master the complex written language, whether it was cuneiform wedges in Mesopotamia or hieroglyphic symbols in Egypt. This was no small feat. It was a skill that took years of dedicated training in temple schools, separating the priesthood from the vast majority of the population who could not read or write. Their literacy was not for studying sacred poetry alone. It was the practical tool for inventorying herds, calculating interest on loans, and drafting labor contracts. In managing the god's wealth, a fascinating blurring occurred. A priest recording the delivery of 40 cattle for a festival was performing a sacred duty to honor the deity, but he was also updating a livestock asset register. When he distributed barley rations to weavers, he was ensuring the god's household ran smoothly, while also acting as a payroll administrator. This seamless fusion of spiritual service and secular administration placed the priesthood at the very center of civic life. Their decisions directly impacted the food supply, the employment of artisans, and the flow of trade. This control over material well-being translated into profound political and social influence. A high priest could advise the king on economic policy, mediate disputes between powerful families, or withhold temple resources to sway a political outcome. Their authority was rooted in a powerful idea. They were not acting for themselves but as stewards for a divine master. This gave their pronouncements a weight that mere royal decrees sometimes lacked, for who could argue with the accountant of a god? The temple bureaucracy thus became a stabilizing force, a permanent institution that could outlast the reign of any single king, ensuring the economic machinery of civilization kept turning, generation after generation, guided by the hands of those who served both heaven and ledger. This immense wealth created by the temple did not exist in a vacuum. It existed in constant, delicate negotiation with another source of power, the palace. The relationship between a king and the temple was a dance of mutual need and simmering tension, a cycle that shaped the politics of the ancient world. A new ruler, eager to prove his divine right to govern, would make a spectacular display of piety, granting vast new lands, herds, and precious metals to the temple of the city's chief god. This was not charity, it was a strategic investment in legitimacy. By enriching the house of the god, the king was publicly demonstrating that he enjoyed the deity's favor, that his reign was blessed and proper. The temple, in turn, would use its spiritual authority to endorse the king, performing rituals that cemented his status in the eyes of the people. This symbiotic exchange made both institutions stronger, but it also sowed the seeds of future conflict. For every gift of land made the temple estate larger, more economically independent, and ultimately more politically formidable. The king had created a powerhouse that could one day rival his own. The cycle was predictable. A successful king would endow the temple, and for a generation harmony reigned. But as the temple's granaries swelled and its administrative reach extended, its high priest could become a figure of immense influence, commanding loyalty from thousands of workers and controlling resources that could fund armies or quell famines. The very institution the king had empowered to bolster his rule could now challenge it. This forced the throne to find ways to reassert control, leading to a fascinating political chess game. In Mesopotamia, a common tactic was for the king to appoint his own son or brother as the high priest. This was a masterstroke. It placed a loyal family member at the helm of the rival economic institution, ensuring the temple's vast resources would remain aligned with royal interests. The boundary between church and state did not just blur, it was deliberately erased through bloodlines. The high priest was now both the chief servant of the god and a direct agent of the crown, a living bridge between the spiritual and secular sources of power. In Egypt, the stakes were even higher and the conflicts more dramatic. We previously touched on the radical pharaoh Akhenaten, but his story is the extreme end of a spectrum. More common were subtle, relentless efforts by the crown to check the temple's growing autonomy. A pharaoh might launch a reform to audit the temple's land holdings, quietly reclaiming some estates for the royal treasury under the guise of administrative efficiency. He might redirect a portion of the lucrative trade that flowed through temple warehouses, claiming it was needed for a national project like a new monument to his own glory. The tension was a constant undercurrent in Egyptian politics. The priesthood of Ammon at Thebes grew so wealthy and influential that by the time of the later New Kingdom, they effectively governed southern Egypt as a separate domain, their power sometimes eclipsing that of the pharaohs ruling from the north. The king was in the precarious position of needing the temple's blessing to rule, while fearing the economic engine that produced that blessing. It was a balancing act that could topple dynasties. This push and pull reveals a fundamental truth about these early civilizations. Political power was not just about military might or royal decree. It was deeply, inextricably tied to economic control. Whoever commanded the granaries, the workshops, and the ledgers held the real keys to stability. The temple, as the original and most sophisticated economic institution, was therefore always a political player. The king could try to co-opt it, to regulate it, or to compete with it, but he could never ignore it. Their relationship was the primary engine of state formation, a dance of gift and control, endowment and audit that played out over centuries. This endless cycle between the palace and the temple precinct was not a flaw in the system. It was the system itself, the dynamic tension that drove these societies forward, for better or for worse. The sacred calendar was a schedule of economic stimulus. Grand religious festivals were far more than spiritual gatherings. They were meticulously planned events of mass redistribution, where the temple's vast stored surplus was converted into public goodwill and economic activity. Think of the Great New Year's Festival in ancient Mesopotamia, a celebration lasting several days. The temple gates would swing open, and a river of abundance would flow out to the people. Stored grain was baked into thousands of loaves of bread. Barley was brewed into vast quantities of beer. Livestock from the divine herds were processed for a public feast. For the common citizen, this was a rare and welcome windfall, a direct payment in food and drink for their loyalty and labor throughout the year. The temple, in turn, was not merely being generous. It was strategically liquidating perishable stores, reinforcing social bonds, and displaying its power through visible, breathtaking generosity. The entire city would partake, from the highest official to the humblest laborer, in a ritual that blurred the line between holy day and payday. This public consumption also served a vital practical purpose. It prevented the catastrophic spoilage of stored food, ensuring that old grain cycled out before the new harvest arrived. The festival was thus a brilliant economic mechanism, a controlled release of capital that fed the populace, cemented social hierarchy, and maintained the quality of the temple's core assets, all under the sacred banner of celebrating the gods. This theatrical piety extended beyond the city's walls. Major festivals often involved a procession, where the statue of the god would be placed upon a magnificent ceremonial barge and paraded along the river or through the countryside to a subsidiary shrine. To the faithful, this was a moment of profound spiritual significance, the deity journeying among the people. To the pragmatic temple administrator and the local merchant, it was something else entirely, a mobile economic catalyst. The route of the procession was not random. It connected the main temple to outlying towns and regional markets. As the divine barge traveled, it was accompanied by a massive entourage of priests, guards, musicians, and officials. This traveling court required food, lodging, and services at every stop, injecting wealth directly into local communities along the way. More importantly, the procession itself became a powerful magnet. Knowing that a huge crowd would gather to witness the holy spectacle, merchants from across the region would flock to the route, setting up temporary markets to sell their wares. A farmer could bring his surplus produce, a potter could display her finest vessels, traders from distant lands would arrive with exotic goods, hoping to capitalize on the concentrated audience. What appeared as a spontaneous market emerging from devotion was, in many ways, a temple-sanctioned trade fair. The sacred occasion provided the safety and the guaranteed crowd that made commerce viable. The temple's role was implicit but central. Its spiritual authority created the secure and festive environment where economic exchange could flourish. A person might come to witness the god's journey and leave having purchased a new bronze tool, some fine cloth or spices from a far-off land, their spiritual and material needs fulfilled in a single event. This fusion was seamless. The economic engine was hidden in plain sight, dressed in the robes of ritual. It demonstrated that in the ancient world, piety and prosperity were not separate pursuits, but intertwined threads in the same social fabric, woven together by the temple's guiding hand. But this brilliant economic engine had a shadow. The very system that provided security could also forge chains of dependency. For the laborer receiving daily rations from the temple, survival was inextricably tied to the institution's continued favor. A failed harvest in your assigned field, an illness that kept you from work, or a simple need for extra resources could force you to seek a loan from the only lender in town, the temple itself. This is where the benevolent redistributive model could tilt toward a harder reality. Records show individuals and entire families who, unable to repay debts of grain or silver, became bound to the temple in a state of perpetual service. Their labor, and sometimes that of their children, became the interest on a loan that might never be fully settled. They were not slaves in the classical sense, but they were not free, existing in a gray area as dependent clients whose lives were mortgaged to the divine estate. This created a social pyramid with a stark divide. At the summit, within the temple's inner sanctums, wealth accumulated on a scale that is still staggering to contemplate. Precious metals, gemstones, fine oils, and exotic imports filled the treasuries, all formerly belonging to the god. Meanwhile, the vast majority of people, the farmers, weavers, millers, and porters, lived a life measured out by the ration list, a predictable but often precarious existence where their portion of barley and oil was both their wage and their tether. The justification for this profound inequality was woven directly into the fabric of belief. The social order was not presented as an economic accident, but as a divine blueprint. The king and high priest were the god's chief stewards, and their lavish lifestyle was a necessary reflection of celestial favor. The laborer in the fields or the workshop was serving the god through their toil, and their modest ration was their rightful share in a holy enterprise. Religion sanctified the hierarchy, transforming economic disparity into a matter of cosmic duty. A hymn or a public ceremony would give thanks for the god's abundance that fed the people, subtly reinforcing the idea that this top-down distribution was the natural, blessed order of things. The system's genius was its ability to frame dependency as devotion and inequality as piety. This does not diminish the very real stability and innovation the temple economy provided, but it reminds us that the foundations of civilization were built with complex materials, blending communal care with calculated control and spiritual meaning with very earthly power. Not every early civilization built its economy around a towering temple. To truly grasp the power of the model we have been exploring, we need to briefly step outside of it, to look at societies that organized their surplus and their labor in a very different way. The contrast is revealing. Take the remarkable Indus Valley civilization, which flourished in what is now Pakistan and northwest India over 4,000 years ago. This was a society of astonishing sophistication with meticulously planned cities, advanced sanitation, and standardized weights and measures that facilitated trade across a vast region. Yet, archaeologists have found no evidence of massive, dominating temple complexes like those in Mesopotamia or Egypt. There are no grand pyramids or ziggurats claiming the city's skyline. Instead, what they have discovered are large, well-built public granaries, strategically located near the city docks. These were not attached to a specific god's house. They seem to have been communal storage facilities. The economic picture that emerges is one of a more distributed, possibly more collective management of surplus. Wealth, in the form of grain, appears to have been held for the benefit of the wider community, perhaps administered by a council of elders or merchant guilds, rather than concentrated under a single priestly hierarchy claiming divine ownership. This suggests a society where economic power was less centralized in a religious institution, creating a flatter, though no less complex, social structure. Similarly, in early China during the Shang and Zhou dynasties, the primary economic unit was not the temple but the ancestral clan. Wealth, land, and labor were controlled by powerful family lineages. The most sacred sites were not temples to a distant god, but ancestral halls where the living communicated with and honored their forebears. The clan head acted as both the family priest and the estate manager. Surplus from the clan's lands was stored in clan granaries and redistributed to clan members. Loyalty and obligation flowed along bloodlines, not through a separate priestly class serving a city god. When large-scale public works were needed, like building city walls or irrigation systems, it was the king mobilizing the labor of these various clans, not a temple bureaucracy directing its own dependent workforce. This clan-based system created a different kind of power dynamic, one where family heritage and connections were the ultimate currency. These examples are not judgments on which system was better. They are different solutions to the same fundamental problem: how to organize people, resources, and surplus to build a stable society. And that is precisely what makes the temple economy of Mesopotamia, Egypt, and Mesoamerica so distinctive. It was not the inevitable path of progress. It was a specific, incredibly potent formula. By fusing ultimate spiritual authority with total economic control in a single, monumental institution, these societies achieved a concentration of power and a capacity for mobilization that was simply unmatched. They could marshal thousands of workers for decades to build a pyramid. They could finance trade expeditions across continents. They could standardize an entire region's economy under a sacred seal. The temple was the engine that made such colossal projects possible. The Indus Valley's communal granaries and early China's clan halls managed complexity brilliantly, but they did not create the kind of centralized, hierarchical machine that could literally move mountains for a god-king. Seeing these alternatives side by side throws the temple's role into sharp relief. It was not merely a place of worship that happened to do business. It was a revolutionary social technology, an architectural and ideological tool for focusing the energy of an entire civilization into a single, divine point of control. Yet for all its sophistication, this divine economic engine rested on a surprisingly fragile foundation. The entire system was a delicate house of cards, built upon two unwavering assumptions: a predictable agricultural surplus and an unbroken line of central authority. Remove either one, and the whole magnificent structure could crumble into dust. The temple's power was a feedback loop of abundance, faith, and control, but that loop was terrifyingly vulnerable to disruption. At its core, the economy ran on grain. The towering granaries, the ration lists, the loans to artisans, the funding for trade expeditions, all of it depended on the annual miracle of the harvest. A single season of drought, a shift in river courses, or a plague of locusts could slash the surplus to a fraction of its normal size. Suddenly, the temple's vast workforce could not be fed. Loans could not be repaid. The carefully balanced ledgers would bleed red ink written not in clay but in hunger and social unrest. The priests could appeal to the gods, but the empty silos spoke a louder, more terrifying truth. The divine landlord's wealth was ultimately hostage to the weather and the soil. This environmental dependency was matched by a political one. The temple's sacred inviolability was not a magical force field. It was a social contract enforced by a stable king and a believing populace. When that central authority shattered, the temple's protections often shattered with it. The cycle of gift and redistribution required a willing giver on the throne, a ruler strong enough to endow the temple and respected enough to keep rival powers from coveting its treasures. Dynastic collapse created a dangerous power vacuum. A weak king or a contested succession meant the flow of royal gifts could dry up. More catastrophically, it meant there was no strong hand to prevent the temple's wealth from becoming a target. Rival factions within the city or invading armies from beyond its walls looked upon those overflowing granaries and jewel-filled treasuries not with piety but with opportunity. The late Bronze Age collapse around 1200 BCE offers a stark portrait of this fragility in action. Across the eastern Mediterranean, a perfect storm of crises unfolded, likely including climate shifts causing drought, earthquakes, and waves of population movements. The great kingdoms, from the Hittites in Anatolia to the Mycenaeans in Greece, saw their palaces burn and their trade networks disintegrate. In this chaos, the temple economies were not spared. With central authority gone, the intricate systems of redistribution ground to a halt. Food stores were looted by the desperate or seized by warlords. The scribes who maintained the records fled or were lost. The sacred statues that embodied the gods themselves were sometimes stripped of their gold and discarded. A complex civilization built over centuries could unravel in a generation, leaving its temple complexes as silent, plundered ruins. This vulnerability was built into the model's very design. By concentrating so much wealth and power in one visible, stationary place, the temple became the ultimate prize and the ultimate point of failure. Its strength was its capacity to focus a civilization's energy, but its weakness was that all of those eggs were in one breathtakingly beautiful and highly conspicuous basket. The system that could build pyramids was also a system that, when it failed, left behind only questions and echoes in the stone. The echoes of those ancient granaries never truly faded. They simply changed their names. When the last priest closed the ledger in a Mesopotamian temple, the idea of a central storehouse for a society's vital surplus did not vanish. It was inherited. The massive state granaries of imperial Rome, the Horia, which stabilized the grain supply for 1 million citizens, were direct secular descendants of the temple warehouse. So too were the vast storehouses maintained by Chinese emperors along the Grand Canal, designed to mitigate famine and control prices. The core principle that a governing body must secure and manage the primary food supply to ensure stability was a lesson learned and institutionalized from those first sacred experiments in economic control. The temple's role as the ultimate vault and lender also found new life far from the ziggurat. In the merchant republics of Renaissance Italy, families like the Medici rose to power not by owning land for a god, but by mastering the flow of money between city-states. Yet their innovations, from letters of credit to double-entry bookkeeping, were solving the same fundamental problems the temple priests once faced: how to move value across great distances and keep impeccable records of complex transactions. The Medici Bank was, in a very real sense, a secular temple treasury, its influence built on trust and financial acumen rather than divine mandate. The priestly bureaucracies themselves transformed. The meticulous scribes who managed the god's estate were the prototypes for all later civil services. The administrative machinery of empires, from the Persian satrapies to the Chinese mandarinate, relied on the same concepts: a literate class of non-royal officials managing resources, collecting dues, and enforcing standard measures in the name of a higher authority, whether that was a king or a state. This lineage suggests our modern economic world is built on very old sacred foundations. The concept of a central bank, an institution that safeguards a nation's wealth and regulates its currency, is a direct philosophical heir to the temple treasury. Our trust in standardized money, in the promise that a paper note or a coin represents a guaranteed value, finds its earliest precedent in the temple's certified weights of silver and the sealed jars of grain. Even the idea of public welfare, of a governing body providing for those in need during a crisis, echoes the temple's ritual redistributions during festivals or hardship. These are not mere coincidences of history. They are strands of economic DNA passed down and adapted through millennia. The forms changed, the justifications shifted from divine will to social contract, but the underlying architectures of trust, centralization, and managed surplus proved to be enduringly effective. We no longer attribute our economic stability to the favor of a storm god, but we still build institutions whose primary function is to perform the same ancient magic, to transform the unpredictable bounty of the world into a system of security and order for all. Yet for all we now understand, fundamental questions still linger in the dust of these ancient sites. Historians and archaeologists are engaged in a lively, ongoing debate, piecing together a puzzle where many of the most crucial pieces are still missing. One of the biggest mysteries is one of sheer scale. We know the temple controlled vast resources, but what exact percentage of a city's total economy did it command? Was it the dominant player, controlling perhaps 70 or 80% of all production and trade? Or was it more of a guiding force alongside other, smaller economic networks? The clay tablets give us snapshots of the temple's own operations, but they are notoriously silent on the vibrant, informal exchanges that must have happened in the city's alleyways and smaller market stalls. This leads to a second, fascinating question. How did private trade and small-scale barter exist in the shadow of such a massive command economy? There must have been a parallel, unofficial market, a gray economy where a farmer could sell a few extra eggs, or a potter could produce vessels outside of the temple workshop for direct sale. These transactions left few written records, making them incredibly difficult for us to see, yet they were likely the lifeblood of daily social interaction and modest individual wealth. Then there are the artifacts that defy easy categorization. archaeologists frequently uncover small, standardized clay objects, sometimes shaped like animals, tools, or simple discs. Were these ritual offerings, children's toys, or something far more significant, like early tokens used to represent quantities of goods in a pre-writing accounting system? The interpretation changes everything. If they are tokens, they could represent a sophisticated, informal economic language that operated alongside the temple's formal scribal records. New technologies are finally allowing us to ask these questions in revolutionary ways. LiDAR, which uses laser pulses to map the ground from the air, is revealing the ghostly outlines of entire cities and irrigation canals buried beneath jungle or desert sands, showing us the true geographical scale of temple-managed landscapes without moving a single stone. Meanwhile, researchers are applying database analysis and even early forms of artificial intelligence to the hundreds of thousands of clay tablet fragments in museum collections. By digitally cross-referencing countless records of commodity prices, personal names, and trade routes, they are detecting subtle patterns and economic relationships that a single scholar reading tablets for a lifetime could never spot. These tools are not providing final answers, but they are illuminating the profound complexity of these ancient systems, reminding us that the temple's economic role was not a monolithic fact, but a dynamic, evolving force, constantly interacting with the ingenuity and enterprise of the people it both served and governed. This hidden economic legacy reshapes our entire understanding of ancient innovation. The towering monuments we admire were not just spiritual triumphs, they were the birthplaces of systems we still rely on today. The temple was the original corporate headquarters, directing vast workforces and supply chains. It was the first central bank, safeguarding wealth and issuing credit. It was the prototype government ministry, managing resources and enforcing standards. To see it only as a church is to miss the point entirely. These complexes were the secret engines of civilization, integrating spiritual authority with economic necessity to forge the world's first managed economies. They solved the fundamental problem of how to organize surplus, labor, and trust on a massive scale, channeling human energy into projects that defined entire cultures. Their true genius lay in that seamless fusion, where every transaction was also an act of devotion, and every ledger entry reinforced a cosmic order. This perspective invites us to look at history with new eyes, to see the administrative brilliance behind the artistic splendor, and to recognize that our modern world of finance and governance stands on very ancient and very sacred foundations. If this journey into the economic heart of antiquity has sparked your curiosity, you will find links to recommended books and documentaries in the description below for a deeper exploration.